Hi, I'm Karen MacNeil. Welcome to WineSpeed.com's People to Know, insider interviews with the most fascinating and important people in the wine business. And today we're here with Jane Ferrari, who is the brand ambassador for Yalumba in the Barossa Valley of Australia. Jane, you are described as a storyteller, a communicator, of course, a brand ambassador. But great wine really is about stories, isn't it?
Well, I think it is. I find everything's more important, everything's more interesting when you know the story behind it.
Yeah.
You know, these days, there's good wine everywhere in the world. In fact, great wine is common. You know, that's a given. There's our viticulturists are red hot, our winemakers are red hot, and now it's like, now the story is coming into its own as being such an important piece of the puzzle, because yes, that's great in the glass, but when you know the story behind it and the story behind the people, it just takes on another dimension, and it becomes a person itself. It gets its own personality itself. So, you know, you've got to have great wine in the glass, that's a given. But then the story is what gives it that X factor, that other dimension, and that's what I think is so important today as today.
Yeah. I find for myself, I'm wondering if this is true for you, that a great wine tastes even better when you know the story. Would you agree?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's a reason why I plan years in advance to take a 5-hour drive from Glasgow to a ferry and then a 3-hour ferry trip across to an island to drink 9 whiskies. Yeah. You know, there's something about the journey.
Yes.
And I think that that's the same in our world. People, I don't know if it's maybe something to do with the whole digital age as well, but people actually want to touch the flame.
Yeah.
They want that, they want to feel like there's a connection more than just in 2D. I don't know if that's, but that's what I'm finding in my travels, and I'm finding it no matter where I travel, that folks, whether they're beginners or whether they're collectors or whether they're in the trade, they want some extra dimension, that extra connection, and that's where the story comes into its own, I think.
Yes, yes. Well, wine really is, you know, it is the story of human endeavor. In some cases, it's the story of success against all odds.
Good luck.
Yes.
Happy historical accident.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's part of it too. You know, and I find that once somebody has that connection, it's like when I was a kid, my mum and dad would read a page there's some classic Australian stories, and one of them's Blinky Bill, The Adventures of Blinky Bill.
I can't say I do not know Blinky, but
well,
okay.
Blinky Bill's a travelling koala bear.
Oh, of course.
And there's a story called Snugglepot and Cuddlepie about gumnut babies that live in the bush. And when I was a kid, my mum and dad would read me a page at night when I went to bed. And, you know, I'm older than 40, and you never forget that. You never forget those characters, and you never forget the story itself, the line. And I think that's the same in our world. I think when people connect with your wine and the story, it becomes theirs, and then they don't forget. And then, so I think in a funny sort of a way, that really simple stuff from when I was a kid has transferred now to something very, very important, you know, in the industry today. You know, I see it as a very simple thing now.
Yeah. Speaking of the industry, what, from your vantage point, is the most exciting thing happening in the Australian wine industry today?
I think the fact that people are realising that we aren't a new thing.
No.
We're a 200-year-old industry. And they call us the new world, and I'd like to know why. And that's why when I tell the historical story of I've done a lot of reading and I've put a lot of timelines together, and my story of the Australian wine industry starts in 1600 when the maritime map of Australia looked like that, just the west coast of Western Australia. And when I start telling that story, I've had journalists stop in their tracks and say, why don't we know this? And I say, well, I don't know why you don't know this. Why do they call us the New World? We've had grapevines in Australia since the first fleet, albeit not to make wine. Well, not to make wine for consumption, for drinking. They used it to make wine to keep the water in the barrels for a 3-month sea voyage sound. But
yes.
We've had grapes in Australia specifically to make wine for consumption as a beverage since 1833.
Right.
Now, how can you call us the New World? So that's where my historical story has caught a lot of people's imagination and also caught a lot of people off kilter, and it's resulted in them having a look at the Australian wine industry in a different perspective. And when I do that, when you backtrack to Australia, to a lot of the regions, and go and see what's happening, you might have, like our operation, our winery is a 170-year-old family business consecutive. But you've got third generation winemaking kids that are doing really spooky stuff in terracotta eggs.
Yes.
So it actually doesn't matter what manifestation of the industry it is, it's coming out of a 200-year-old base.
Yes.
And so that for me is the most exciting thing, that maybe we're starting to get the recognition that we're not a newcomer at all. We're not the new world at all.
No, you're really
We're kind of the custodians of sorts in all sorts of different, as I said, in all sorts of different ways. We're kind of the custodians of the old world.
Well, I actually think, I'm pretty sure this is true for Cabernet, that the oldest Cabernet in the world is in Australia. It's quite possible that the oldest Grenache in the world is in Australia. And I actually think the oldest Chardonnay in the world right now is in Australia.
Well, I'm not sure about that as far as, I know that Chateau Tabilque's got some really old vines. I know that we've got some very old 1856 planted Grenache in the Barossa,
right.
with Marco down there. But I can tell you for absolutely definite that the mother vines for a lot of these things, Shiraz and Cabernet and not so much Chardonnay, it's a relatively newcomer to our scene. But having said that, we haven't had phylloxera devastate our regions either, touch wood. So yeah, they are seriously old vines.
Right.
And we don't have that sort of idea where they become commercially not viable at 30 years of age, so you've got to pull them out and replace them. We actually really, really value those older vines, Yeah. And so yeah, I think it's really, that's pretty exciting for us.
Now, you started as a winemaker. You trained as a winemaker. You went to school to become a winemaker. Are you happy to leave winemaking to others at this point, then?
Absolutely. I made a lot of really crazy career choices that actually, in the longer journey, as often is the case, brought me to a really interesting place where I am now, and I find I'm very, very happy with the role I've got now. I have a great story to tell. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking about the Australian industry history that starts back in 1600. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking about the Barossa, which has really, I've been very fortunate that Barossa has adopted me. And it doesn't matter whether I'm talking about our own business at Yalumba or our neighbours. It really doesn't matter which level you're working at. There's so many great stories, and so you're really overwhelmed with which direction you can go because it's all so good and largely unknown. Mm-hmm. So, I had a crack at making wine with a mate, and it was pretty good. But it just wasn't wasn't the way I was meant to go, I don't think. So yeah. I'm really pleased because I'm a far better storyteller than I ever would have been a winemaker. And there's so many of those out there. So no, I'm happy as. Yeah. I'm really happy. And not only that, it's given me a chance to travel the world.
Yes.
So
yeah.
I'm really pleased.
Now, what is it about wine that moves you personally? When you're tasting it, what is it?
I think for me, and I'm probably out there on my own with this, when I was a kid, I went to Roseworthy College straight from high school, so I went at 17, and the only knowledge I had of wine at the time was from my family situation where my dad was Italian and we had wine in the house, you know, from as long as I can remember. But, and so I was learning at a rate of knots when everybody else knew a huge amount about wine, so I was a learner for a long time. But now, right at this end of my career, I tend to see, because I've got the benefit of hindsight as well, and I've seen some great wines made by great people over a huge long period of time, I tend to see each bottle as a time capsule. And that time capsule represents what that person did at that time, you know, and this is the record of that. So tonight we'll be looking at something from the 1930s made by Seppeltsfield. Now, in the 1930s, it was the middle of the Depression. We'd been making brandy at a rate of knots for the British Empire until the end of the First World War, 1918. And then all of a sudden they said, oh, terribly sorry, we haven't got any money, we won the war, but we're kind of bankrupt, so we don't need your wine. All of a sudden, we don't have any customer for all this extraordinary fortified and brandy spirit that we've been making for 60 years. So that time capsule in 1939 is, oh my goodness me, we're going to have to put this in a bottle and hope for the best down the track that we're going to find someone that we can sell this to, because at the minute, you know, we're in the Depression. So when you look at that, the spirit's pristine. The fruit has got depth like, you know, it's just extraordinary, and it's layer upon layer upon layer. And it shows you that all those people that were working so hard at the time in 1939 to keep everything together did such an extraordinary job. So if you contrast that today with somebody making, you know, like someone making Riesling from either Clare, Watervale or from the Eden Valley, those vines 9 times out of 10 are from the 1940s, 50s or 60s. Fancy somebody in the 1940s or 50s planting Riesling to make a table wine for a country that largely didn't have any Mediterranean influence, was very English in its cooking, so it was kind of boil, bake and ruin. But people were planting this extraordinarily aromatic, you know, seafood-driven, Asian, Mediterranean kind of complementary thing that we have now as a matter of course, but yet back in the 1930s and 40s wouldn't have been so. They were drinking hot lime and lemon, Riesling, soda and lemon slices. Oh. so you know, I see each wine as a time capsule, you know, and then you look at something like the 1985, I just picked this out of my head, 1985 Seppelt's Great Western Sparkling Burgundy. Of course we can't call it Burgundy because it's, you know, not Burgundy, but that's what it was called in the time. And they were told by the accountants, the winemakers, not to make sparkling red because it wasn't economically viable. But they made it, they put it in the drives underneath Great Western, they cemented it up, and then down the track, when it changed hands, the new owners found it and they had this treasure trove of base wine that was extraordinary and has gone on to become a stalwart for the Australian industry. So in a funny way, I see all those wines as time capsules. Even, you know, the young kids making natural wines now, that is their time and place. And it's a different manifestation of the industry, but it's a time capsule of that moment. So that's how I see it, which is probably not what a lot of folks say.
Last question. What character trait do you think you personally possess that has made you a successful person in the industry? Because you've won a number of awards, you're well known, especially in Australia. But what character trait do you think you have?
Ooh, well, probably a couple. The first one is probably more persistent than most. I I don't like to let things go easily. So I kind of like, if I've got a pretty good idea that that's how I think things are going to go, or I pretty much stick to it. And I'm pretty persistent, and I've been telling stories for a long time, a long time before they became trendy. You know, and now I kind of giggle a little bit, because now storytelling is so cool. And it's the first time I've been cool in my career, and I'm loving it. So I'd say I'm pretty persistent. The other thing I think, and this is going to sound weird because I pretty much talk for a living, but I actually think I'm a good listener. And I've done a good job of collecting a lot of stories. And a lot of it's spoken word. You know, a lot of it's not written down. And some of the stories that really resonate with folks are the ones that I've picked up by sitting in sheds, or sitting on buses, or sitting in trains, and just listening to folks tell stories. You know, I was in a funny old silver mining town in the middle of Nevada for the last couple of days, and they were talking about a hotel next door that was supposedly haunted by this lady. And there's been so many occurrences that you can't ignore it. But I was talking to the lady who was just the receptionist at the motel where I was staying, you know, and the Australian dollar's so rubbish at the moment. I've been staying at places under $80 American, which gives you a whole new view of America. But I said to her, what do you think about that? And she said to me, well, this is a mining town, and mining towns are full of people with hopes and dreams. And I've written a lot of poetry over the years, and I've only been game enough lately to perform it. And I find people really enjoy it, the funny stuff and the not so funny. And as I was driving up this morning, I thought to myself, you know what? There's a poem in that, you know? And it's like, mining towns are full of people with hopes and dreams. And I think I'm the lucky one that's just passing through. Why wouldn't the ghosts want to leave when their hearts are broken and their dreams just don't come true? So I think it's in the story. You can pick up stories anywhere. So, long answer to a short question, I think I'm pretty persistent and I'm a good listener.
Excellent, Jane. Well, thank you for joining us. And our full interview with Jane Ferrari is on winespeed.com on the People to Know page. Check it out. You're really going to like it.